We now have the news as broadcast by ITN to Europe last night. The time, 5 o'clock.
Major row over safety after London's worst underground fire. Paris firemen practice their safety drill. Left-wing guerrillas plant bombs in Lima. Now superpowers talk about nuclear testing. Hello, I'm John Suchet in London with the world news from ITN. A major safety investigation has begun after 30 people died in Britain's worst ever underground railway fire. The victims were trapped by smoke and flames when the fire broke out in London's busiest station, King's Cross. A special ITN inquiry has revealed that the station did not have important safety systems of the kind which exist in Paris, Frankfurt, New York, Montreal and Moscow. The exact cause of the fire is still a mystery, but it's thought to have started on one of the station's 60-year-old wooden escalators. The fire then spread up into the main ticket hall, and it's there that most of the victims died. Among them was a fireman who had braved thick smoke without special breathing apparatus in an attempt to rescue members of the public.
It was an inferno of heat, smoke and flames, a nightmare for scores of passengers trapped in a ticket hall 20 feet below ground. Tonight it's still not certain what caused Britain's worst tube fire, but its effects are tragically clear. 30 people are dead and many badly burned. Survivors spoke of the intense heat and flames which drove passengers screaming through smoke-filled tunnels. Concrete and brick radiated heat. Burning ceiling tiles rained down. Acrid smoke suffocated many of the victims. The exits acted as chimneys, funneling the fire back down underground. Asbestos was an added hazard. At one point, rescue workers had to stop work because of it. Desperate attempts were made to revive the bodies pulled from the ticket hall. King's Cross is London's busiest underground station. There are 5 tube lines running into a mainline station. The fire broke out near the top of the Piccadilly line escalator into the ticket hall. This hall is situated 20 feet below ground level. Smoke immediately filled the ticket hall and the exits to the street and billowed back down the escalator to the platform.
The fire spread suddenly and dramatically, and a sheet of flame came across the top of the escalator, filling the whole of the space at the top of the escalator right up to the ceiling.
Several died despite desperate attempts to revive them. It was impossible to quickly identify 17 of the bodies, so badly were they burnt. The hopes of many relatives were dashed when they arrived at a temporary coroner's court set up in a nearby hall. Time and again the firemen plunged into the smoke-filled darkness, a journey into the unknown, as one of them described it. Despite their breathing apparatus, many of them were overcome. One fireman, Staff Officer Colin Townsley, died. He may have gone in unprotected, a gut reaction to save as many passengers' lives as possible, whatever the personal cost. There were maps of the underground available, but they were stored in the ticket office, and firemen had to fight through flames to reach them. But at dawn, as forensic officers moved in to investigate the cause of the blaze, questions were already being asked about staffing levels at stations like King's Cross, where there have been cutbacks. Are there enough London Transport employees to keep the stations in good repair and assist people should there be an emergency? The images of heroism and tragedy at King's Cross Station were summed up by fireman Treffry from his hospital bed.
The heat and the smoke is a part of the fire brigade. You were set there, and you were set there's a danger to it. But even when it comes home, it's still hard to accept that you've lost somebody, and that will always be there.
Operators of underground railways all over the world have been considering their own safety procedures in the light of the London fire disaster. As ITN's Simon Marks reports, many other countries have already invested millions of dollars in sophisticated safety devices for their stations.
Smoke billows out of a Paris metro station. Emergency services hurry to the scene, aware of what is expected of them. Each fireman has a map of the station. This wasn't the real thing, just an exercise, ironically taking place within hours of the fatal London fire. It was one of two practices the French put together every year, with a seriousness that is echoed on underground systems worldwide. The Paris metro is fully equipped to deal with a disaster. Smoke detectors have been installed and the remaining wooden escalators are all being replaced. 300 security agents patrol the system 24 hours a day, checking for fire. In New York, the story is much the same. A series of fires on the subway in the 1970s led to safety rules being tightened. Smoking is banned everywhere and work crews remove all the rubbish from beneath the escalators once a week. The last wooden staircase was replaced in 1985. But safety costs money. $10 billion had to be raised for the New York improvements. In Washington, authorities are considering spending $40 million to improve safety on their subway after concerns were expressed about the system's ventilation. But already there are sprinklers wherever there is material that can catch fire, and firefighters can use water pipes which connect right into the tunnels of the underground to fight any blaze. In Montreal, safety on the subway means 88 full fire drills in the last 3 years and a special ventilation system built into the tunnels. An inspection team travels the system around the clock, and all the city's firemen have access to maps of all the city's stations. In Moscow, the authorities have recently been concentrating on trying to improve the elaborately designed underground system. At one point, 200 accidents were taking place there each year.
Other world news now in brief. Drugs officers in the United States have found more than 4 tons of cocaine hidden in a warehouse in Miami. They say it's America's largest ever drugs find. The drugs have an estimated street value of over $60 million. Authorities in the Philippines have charged 19 people with the murder of 3 Americans near a United States Air Force base last month. But police say that 18 of those charged have still not been captured. Nigerian police fired tear gas at crowds of rioters in the capital Lagos on the 3rd day of violent protests there. The disturbances began after 2 pedestrians were shot dead by a policeman. Left-wing guerrillas in Peru have carried out a series of bomb attacks around the capital Lima during a night of widespread violence. The targets included the American embassy. In another incident, police killed 4 rebels who had set fire to a Japanese car factory.
The guerrillas launched their attack on the Nissan factory under the cover of darkness after first destroying power lines around the city. Police and Nissan security guards moved in, killing 4 of the rebels and wounding another 2. The men, members of the Maoist Shining Path group, ran a night of violence around the country. The guerrillas have been operating in the poorer areas of Peru for more than 6 years now, mainly in control around the high Andes mountains. In further outbreaks of unrest, workers from the health sector staged angry demonstrations around the ministry over demands for higher wages. Several people were injured during violent clashes with the police, and several arrests were made.
Iran says that Iraqi planes have bombed an unfinished Iranian nuclear power plant for the 3rd time this week. 10 people were killed in an Iraqi attack on the Bushehr plant on Tuesday. Building work at the site was suspended 2 years ago because of the risk of attacks. Iraq has released television pictures of an alleged Iranian attack on a hospital at Dohuk in the north of Iraq. 9 people were killed and 64 others were wounded when the hospital was bombed on Wednesday. President Reagan said he saw no reason to believe that the American budget deficit would drag the world into an economic recession. He was speaking as American negotiators continued their efforts to agree on a plan to cut the deficit. But the 19th day of talks passed without any positive results. That caused Wall Street stocks to fall again. The Dow Jones Industrial Average closed at 1,895.39, and that's down 43.77 on the day. With the details, here's Penny Marshall.
It was an upbeat speech designed to give confidence not just to America but to the world's financial markets. This was President Reagan's first important economic statement since last month's crash. He urged the Congress negotiators to press hard for an agreement in their talks for a reduction in the budget deficit.
It is vital that the negotiators complete their work now. Any agreement that comes from these sessions probably will not be the final word on reducing the federal budget deficit, but it will be the right signal at the right time and will show our determination to work together to solve this problem. Now is the time for final action, and now is the time for fairness.
If the negotiators do not come up with a deal, there will be automatic cuts in spending under the Gramm-Rudman Act, and neither America nor the world's markets want that. President Reagan called last month's crash part of a long-awaited adjustment. He said he did not believe it signalled the beginning of a world recession. But his optimism was not enough to bring confidence to the markets. The dollar dropped over half a pfennig against the mark. Against the yen, it edged lower to close at 135.2. And the pound rose against the dollar by just under a cent. All the world's stock markets were down. The Financial Times 100 index fell nearly 20 points to close at 1369.1. In Frankfurt, the Commerzbank 60-share index fell to close just above 1355. The Nikkei Dow closed before Mr. Reagan's speech, but investors were nervous as they awaited news of the Washington talks. It fell more than 65 points.
The business news. In part 2, we'll have a selection of stories from Europe, and we'll have a special report. Stories still to come. Goria's new government already suffers defeat. No word of melody, but kidnappers lower the ransom. Protestant politician attacked by gunmen in Belfast.
Bow, bow, bow.
To all you out there, with your heavy lives and heavy beers, we, who drink Miller Lite, the clean, smooth lager, with more of the sugar turned to alcohol, have the following message. Heavy. Buying a TV or a video? What if it breaks down? How soon will it be repaired? At what cost? But now there's a great way to buy from Vision Hire. Vision Plan. With small regular payments and all the benefits of the Vision Hire rental service, which means repairs within a day at no extra cost, and after 3 years, the set's all yours. You can even extend the service cover. So with Vision Plan from Vision Hire, you can have your cake and eat it.
For as long as we can all remember, people have dreamed of a Channel tunnel. Now Eurotunnel, a private sector group, has been formed to build and operate a rail link between Britain and the continent. Planned to open in 1993. The Eurotunnel share offer is now on. Phone this number for a prospectus or application form, or call at any NatWest or Midland bank. The offer closes on Friday, November the 27th.
Here is the news.
News is good.
News and views.
News, and...
News, and... No news.
bad news.
It's another big November issue of TV Times. There's a revealing interview with Paul McCartney, now 45, a multi-millionaire, but what's the one thing he can't have? Watch him live on ITV and Channel 4. Come to Hollywood to meet Bill Cosby, once a ghetto child and now the world's highest paid entertainer. Focus on fashion with frocks on the box. You can claim your free Royal Anniversary stamps and find out how to complete the collection. Enter our Spanish wine holiday competition, only in this week's big TV Times.
TV Times.
Welcome back. In this part 2, we have a roundup of stories from Europe. We begin in Italy, where the Prime Minister Giovanni Goria is preparing for a vote of confidence in his new government just 5 days after he resigned. The brief political crisis ended when the 5 parties of Italy's coalition agreed to reform despite a dispute over economic policy. But the new government has already suffered an embarrassing defeat. The Italian parliament has voted against funding for Italy's naval force in the Gulf.
It's now clear that President Cossiga rejected the resignation 5 days ago of Italy's novice Prime Minister, Signor Goria. He was told to sort out his squabbling coalition and carry on with Italy's 47th government since the war. By restoring exactly the same coalition, Signor Goria is following a familiar routine of Italian politics, greeted with cynicism by the public and press, which labelled the 5-day crisis a waste of time. At the centre again is the former socialist Prime Minister Bettino Craxi. His reputation for Machiavellian political manoeuvring has been enhanced by reports that he engineered the resolution through a series of private telephone conversations with his main rivals at the Christian Democratic headquarters. Already, though, the government has been humiliated with a vote against financing Italy's navy in the Gulf. It will now have to issue an emergency decree to, as one politician said, prevent our sailors having to swim home.
The kidnappers of 5-year-old Melody Nakachian have again lowered their ransom demand. They are now asking for $4 million. They originally demanded $13 million for her release. A caller with an Arabic accent has told a Spanish newspaper that Melody will be killed or starved if the ransom is not paid. Melody's father appeared on television with a lock of his daughter's hair and a photograph sent by the kidnappers. He says people from all over Spain are sending him gifts of money to help him raise the ransom. Stories from elsewhere in Europe. 6 prisoners have escaped from a jail at Orbe in western Switzerland by sawing through the bars of a cell. The 6 include Frenchman Charles Altieri, who was imprisoned just 3 weeks ago for manufacturing heroin in a secret laboratory. The Polish leader General Jaruzelski has arrived in Athens for a 3-day official visit. It's the first time a Polish leader has been to Greece. He'll be meeting the Greek Prime Minister Andreas Papandreou for talks on Friday. Yugoslavia's poorest region, Macedonia, has asked the Yugoslav government to reconsider its freeze on wages and prices. Thousands of workers in the region have gone on strike in protest against the freeze. The Yugoslav government has introduced the measures to combat inflation, which is running at 135%. One of Northern Ireland's most outspoken Protestant politicians has been shot and wounded in Belfast. George Seawright is fighting for his life in hospital. Mr. Seawright is well known for his verbal attacks on Catholics. The terrorist group, the Irish National Liberation Army, says it shot him.
George Seawright, a hardline loyalist, was allowed to carry a gun for protection during his time as a Belfast assemblyman. But the firearm which he once brandished in the heart of Republican Belfast was confiscated after he was convicted of disorderly behaviour. He warned then that he would become a target. Nevertheless, he maintained a high profile. He was jailed for trying to attack Secretary of State Tom King, and he publicly announced that all Catholics should be burned. Today, his prediction that he would become a target turned to reality. As he sat in the passenger seat of this car, parked off the Shankill Road, a gunman shot him in the back of the head.
But we heard a bang, and we just ran out of the shop, straight down to the car, and seen George sitting there.
As he was taken to hospital critically ill, a splinter group of the Irish National Liberation Army said they shot him. Terry Lloyd, ITN, Belfast.
Next, our special report, where we look in depth at a story in the news. While the Geneva talks on scrapping medium-range missiles have now reached a successful conclusion ahead of next month's superpower summit, another set of talks there have resumed. They're about limiting the testing of nuclear weapons. Their first session ends on Friday. President Reagan insists that test explosions are essential while the West depends on nuclear weapons. But the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev believes that stopping tests is the key to halting the arms race. Controversy over nuclear testing dates back to 1945, when America detonated the world's first atomic bomb as part of its wartime Manhattan Project. Albert Clack of ITN's World News has this report.
More than 320 nuclear weapons tests were conducted in the atmosphere between 1945 and 1963. America exploded 183, Russia 118, Britain 18 and France 4. By the mid-1950s, public opinion had become aware of the dangers from radioactive fallout. There were demonstrations calling for a ban on nuclear testing. But it wasn't until 1963 that Russia, America and Britain signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty to halt nuclear tests in the atmosphere. For some, the treaty had already come too late. Thousands of people in the Third World suffered radiation sickness. They were victims of American explosions in the Pacific and British ones in Australia and the Indian Ocean. And the treaty didn't end the fallout danger. Other countries carried on testing in the atmosphere. France detonated its first bomb in the Sahara Desert in 1960. Later, the French switched to the South Pacific and tested in the atmosphere there until 1975. China exploded its first bomb in Xinjiang in 1964 and has continued to carry out tests in the atmosphere. India tested a nuclear device in its Rajasthan desert in 1974. Near South Africa's Marion Island, a flash that some analysts interpreted as a nuclear test was observed by a satellite in 1979. And in Nevada and Kazakhstan, America, Britain and Russia pressed on with underground nuclear testing. So what purposes are served by continuing to test?
There are two reasons why nuclear tests are conducted. One is to develop new warhead designs. In order to have them serviceable and reliable, you need between 5 and 10 tests to perfect a new warhead. So, for example, the laboratories are working on something called the Earth-penetrating warhead in Nevada at the moment. You can't do this by computer. The second reason is the effects of nuclear explosions on military hardware. They test to assess the effects of nuclear explosions on their own hardware and that of the Soviet Union.
Two superpower treaties in 1974 and 1976 limited the size of underground explosions to 150 kilotons. That's 7.5 times as powerful as the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima at the end of the Second World War. These treaties were never ratified by the American Senate or the Supreme Soviet, and talks since then have made little progress. But in August 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev declared a unilateral Soviet suspension of nuclear testing. President Reagan rejected Mr. Gorbachev's suggestion that both superpowers should halt their test programs, and America exploded more than 20 bombs during the 18-month Soviet moratorium. Why did America refuse Mr. Gorbachev's offer?
A number of reasons were advanced. One was that while the security of the United States rests on nuclear deterrence, nuclear tests would be needed to make sure that the nuclear weapons were reliable. But more realistically, of course, the Reagan administration has set great store by the Strategic Defense Initiative, which in large part will depend upon nuclear pumped directed energy weapons concepts. This will require nuclear testing.
Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze and American Secretary of State Shultz met several times this year, and Mr. Shultz accepted a Russian proposal for each of the two countries to explode nuclear weapons at the other's test site.
One of the points about the threshold test ban treaty, which has to be ratified, is that both sides have to be confident that neither is straying over the 150 kiloton limit. The Americans have devised an instrument called Cortex, which they claim, contrary to the Soviets, is more accurate than the remote method of measuring the size of the tests, which involves assessing the size of shock waves sent into the outer shell of the Earth by the explosion. So if you put an explosive device of known magnitude in a hole next to your Cortex instrument, you can be sure that it's calibrated against the particular set of conditions that you find at the Soviet test site and the reverse, the American test site.
The talks in Geneva have as their ultimate aim to end all nuclear tests, but both sides say the first step must be effective verification. So what progress can be expected?
I think they'll be able to move fairly rapidly to a state of affairs that's acceptable to both of them on the existing treaties. But until September, when Mr. Schultz met Mr. Shevardnadze in Washington, the Americans had been so implacably opposed to any limitations on nuclear testing that I'll be very surprised if they move quickly towards a quota of tests or some agreement like that, and even more surprised if they move quickly towards any sign of ending nuclear tests forever.
Could we have a comprehensive test ban treaty one day?
We could have a test ban treaty which would effectively end all nuclear tests of militarily useful size. That's anything over about 1 kiloton, relatively easy, relatively quickly, and with existing technology to verify it.
America's Star Wars project for defense in space needs nuclear testing to generate its powerful lasers. And the Soviet Union insists that Star Wars is an obstacle to reducing the number of long-range missiles. So these talks on nuclear tests are inextricably linked with wider arms control negotiations. It therefore seems unlikely that the world will see an end to nuclear explosions until the missiles themselves are scrapped.
Now, a look ahead to some events happening on Friday. It's the deadline for America to set a new budget deficit. Nikolai Ryzhkov, the Soviet Prime Minister, goes to New Delhi for an official visit. And an Ariane rocket is due to be launched in French Guiana. The launch was delayed from earlier this week after the discovery of an electrical fault. Finally, the headlines again. Italy's Prime Minister Signor Goria is preparing for a vote of confidence in his new government just 5 days after he resigned. Left-wing guerrillas in Peru have carried out a series of bomb attacks on targets, including the American embassy. And our main report, a major safety investigation has begun after 30 people died in Britain's worst ever underground railway fire. An ITN inquiry has revealed that King's Cross Station did not have important safety equipment. And that's the world news from ITN. From me, goodbye.